I hope I can talk my parents into buying me an Atari 800XL.
Oh, tell them all the things it can do for you.
Right. I'll tell them it's got 256 colors and 4 sound channels.
I don't know, that's a little technical. Why don't you tell them it'll help you learn music and art?
Well, and there's integrated software for word processing, spreadsheets, forecasting.
No, tell them it'll help you write term papers.
I'll tell them it's expandable with serial link peripherals like modems and disk drives.
Tell them it's your birthday.
What's up, people? How you doing today? Christmas 2019. Actually, it's a couple days until Christmas, but I figured this is going to be my last video before the end of the year, so I would go ahead and shoot it in the spirit of the holiday season. Today I'm going to do something a little different. We're not going to talk so much about programming as I am about this guy right here. This is an 800XL introduced in 1983 by Atari. This was donated to me by one of the viewers on the channel. And the reason this computer is very special to me is that because this was my first 8-bit computer. It was the first computer that I received as a kid back in the early 80s, and it's what got me started programming and fixing electronics and going down the whole technology path. So we're going to talk about this machine specifically today, and it was going to be a review video primarily, but it turned out to be a repair/review video, which is kind of cool because you're going to learn a little bit about the insides of this machine and how I repaired or upgraded the video on the monitor port. So stick around. I think you're going to enjoy this one. So one of my viewers was gracious enough to donate an Atari 800XL computer to the channel so that we could review it and do some programming on it. So I got the computer in the mail, and a big shout out to Anthony Ferraro for sending this computer in and donating it to the channel. Thanks again for that. Now, before we actually look at the computer, let's take a brief look into history and find out what the 800XL is all about. The Atari 800XL was released in 1983, and it made a big splash on the scene as it was one of the first computers that came with 64K of memory built into the computer, ready to go. Along with its top-loading cartridge slot, it was a high-powered machine ready to go for games and programming. It was a smaller, compact design than the former Atari 800, and it had built-in basic programming language, self-tests already built into the ROMs. These built-in self-tests would allow you to check all of your ROM and RAM memory banks right from the self-test screen. It also tested the audio and visual, along with a built-in keyboard test for testing your keyboard and all the associated function keys.
Oh, yes! That's awesome!
The 800XL was powered by an MOS 6502, slightly modified for the Atari line, also known as the Sally. It is an 8-bit processor running at 1.79 MHz. The Atari 8-bit computers were the first home computers designed with custom coprocessor chips. Chips such as the GTIA, the Antic, and the Pokey. These custom chips offloaded a lot of the processing for graphics from the central processor and allowed the Atari to do some pretty radical stuff even for an 8-bit computer in the day. As a matter of fact, my first computer was an Atari 800XL. This is the computer that started it all for me. I first learned how to play games on the computers, load disks, and then I was able to finally upgrade to a 130XE eventually. But as you can see, they're very similar in size. The 130XE is a little bigger. The 800XL is a little longer because it has the function keys down on the right-hand side. But for the most part, they're pretty much the same size in general. One thing I've always liked about the 800XL is the fact that the cartridge slot is on the top, which makes it a heck of a lot easier when inserting and removing cartridges. When they moved the cartridge port to the back on the XE series, it just made it a little bit more difficult sometimes to fiddle back there and get the cartridge placed in. So that's one thing I've always liked about the 800XL. The other thing I love about the 800XL, in my opinion, is that the keyboard is a much better built keyboard. It has a better response to it. It's easier to type on, and it takes less force from your fingers to actually activate the keys and make them respond. Now, as you can see, this 800XL is quite yellowed, but we'll take care of that later on when we retrobrite it. On the back of both computers, the input-output ports are almost exactly the same. We've got a power switch. They both have the plug for the actual power itself, the 5 volts DC that's required. They both have RF modulator output RCA plugs, which traditionally was left for plugging into like your traditional TV, and then a selector switch where you could choose between channels 2 and 3. So they're both exactly the same as far as that regard. They both have a monitor output port. It's a 5-pin port which supports chroma, luma signal, plus a mono audio. Both computers have expansion ports. The 800XL, if I could get the cover off, the expansion port is a little different than what's on the 130XE. The 130XE, obviously it's got the cartridge port in the back, and then it's got the expansion bus on the back, which physically is a little different than the 800XL as far as the pinout and the size. But they're both used as expansion ports that give you direct access to the bus. For adding, and there were quite a few peripherals that were made back in the day. And we'll be reviewing some of them in the future that you can actually use. And then you have your standard serial input-output, which is used for connecting printers, modems, tape cassette loaders, disk drives, and that sort of thing. So the 800XL, it's a beefy, nice little computer. Like I said, very comfortable to use, very comfortable to type on. Function keys down on the right-hand side, and overall it's a beautifully designed machine. And once we get into it here, I'm going to show you how nicely laid out the board is. Also introduced with the 800XL came the 1050 floppy disk drive for storing programs and for booting up the disk operating system, which would allow you to load and save programs from the floppy drive. Also introduced was the Atari 1010 cassette recorder. It was stylish and simplistic to use, and it was very popular in the European markets where money was tight and the majority of software was available on cassette tapes. Now, I noticed after I plugged it in that the blue screen looked a little off. It looked a little weak. I did a couple of self-test checks on the machine, and it looked almost grayscale, black and white. These self-test screens have different colors associated with them, green and yellow, and none of those colors were coming through. So I turned the machine off and on a couple times, went back into the self-test, and I just wasn't getting the right colors that you would expect from the 800XL or for any of the 8-bit computers. You'll notice when I go into the memory test here in a second that the memory blocks are normally yellow and green as it's going through the self-test, and they looked really just like black and white grayscale. So I knew something was up with this machine. We weren't getting the right color output, and to demonstrate that, I'll plug the 130XE back in, and you'll see the difference in the colors. You'll see the high contrast bright blue screen that you should expect to see on the monitor output, and I don't have an RF composite adapter to actually see what it looks like, and I don't have an old school television, so I just noticed that from looking at it, face on that the color was off. So we're definitely gonna have to take a look at that and see what's going on. You can see here that the self-test is yellow, and you've got you know, a different color look on the 130XE. So we're gonna have to take a look at this and see, you know, what's actually going on with the 800XL. I don't know if it's a cable problem or if it's something, you know, internally wrong with the board, but we're gonna check it out right now and see what's going on with that. So to take apart the 800XL, there's 6 screws on the back that have to be removed. They come out pretty easily, and that'll allow us to get into the case without further issues. Once you get the top cover off, you've got to disconnect the keyboard connector. It just kind of pulls right out. No big issue there. Once the keyboard is disconnected, then we've got to basically deal with the RF shielding. The RF shielding was put there originally to prevent any interference with the television sets of the day. But I usually remove the RF shielding and just put it away for storage, as I don't usually put it back on the computers. You know, once I'm using the computers, I leave the RF shield out. I used a 6mm socket to get the nuts off that are holding the RF shield in place. Once we have the RF shield removed, we have access to the main board, which then at that point pretty much will lift out with care from the bottom case. Right here you can see the RF shield, you can see the monitor port, and that's the cartridge port right there. So we'll go ahead and lift this main board out of the shell. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and label these chips with my handy dandy label maker so we know exactly what chips are what on this board. I usually do this for all my 8-bit computers because I end up going back in there at some point and working on them or doing some kind of upgrade on them. So it's nice to know what chips I'm working with. And this board is all socketed, which is nice. We're not going to have to be doing any desoldering on this board for any future chip replacement or upgrades. Now there's several areas of interest on the 800XL that deal with the video output. Obviously you've got the GTIA chip, which controls the television interface, and you've got several capacitors and transistors with diodes and resistors that control the color amplification that feed the monitor output and also the RF modulator. So I'm going to be checking most of this circuitry, you know, with a digital logic probe and also my meter to see if I'm getting the voltages that are required in those areas. So I'm going to start by connecting my digital probe. This is an Elenco digital probe, and it allows you to read high and low states from TTL and CMOS logic, and also you can see pulses if certain ICs are giving out high or low frequencies. And this basically gives me an idea if certain chips have activity going on in them, if their voltages are actually there, and it just gives you a general idea of what ICs are working and which ones may not be working. Now I'm testing very specific pins that I know have certain signals coming off them, such as 5 volts, pins that are being held high or low, other pinouts that are sending color signals to the color amplification circuitry, and so on. Now, obviously referring to the schematics for the board beforehand will give you an idea of how it should be functioning and what you should be looking for. But for the most part, I was receiving most of the signals that I was expecting, and it didn't appear to me at the surface that anything specific was going on that would lead me to believe that the board was not functioning properly. Now, as with any good troubleshooting, you want to obviously use a multimeter to check for your main voltages and make sure that that voltage is present on, you know, your VSS pins for your ICs and maybe some other test points on the board. And it appeared that the 5 volts and some of the other voltages I was looking for were present. So at this point, I really didn't know what was going on with the board, if anything specific was malfunctioning and giving that gray look on the output of the monitor port. One easy troubleshooting step that I thought I'd take is I'd swap the GTIA chip from the 800XL and the 130XC, since I know my 130XC is working fine. But one thing I have to consider is that on the 130XC, the GTIA chip is actually soldered to the board. So we're going to have to desolder that chip. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to put a socket in its place. Anytime you take a chip out of a board that is soldered down, it's always a good idea to put a socket back in its place to make sure that if you ever need to replace the chip or pull it out again, you don't have to desolder it again. And of course, anytime you're going to put a socket in, make sure you get pin 1 aligned with the right direction on the board. There's a notch on the socket. Make sure you get that notch aligned the right way, which is usually to the left as you're looking at the board from the front view, so that you know that you have the right orientation of the socket. So now that we've got the GTIA chip swapped out, let's plug the computer in and see if we've made any difference. And unfortunately, we've got the same issue. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this chip back out, put it back in the 130XE, and put the original one back in. And we'll have to move on to the next step of troubleshooting. Now, I was fortunate enough to be looking around some of the forums on Atari Age, and I noticed an article someone had written where he described that some of the 800XLs that came from the factory actually came from the factory without the Chroma Luma pin on the monitor port connected to the appropriate spot on the video amplification area on the board. And I looked on the back of this 800XL, and sure enough, that pin on the monitor port is not connected anywhere and is just wide open. So I took a chance at following the instructions I found online and running a jumper wire from that pin to R6768 on the board. And I wanted to see if that was actually going to solve my problem and give me the correct signal that I was missing on the output of the monitor port. And voila! What do you know? We've got our saturated rich blue color on the ready screen, which is already telling me that fixed the problem. So I went ahead and threw in a couple cartridges just to see the color shine through like it's supposed to. And whammo, there we go.
It's alive!
So now comes the easy part. All we have to do is put it back together. Now, like I said before, I don't put my screws back in, I don't put the RF shield back in, but I do save those components if I ever want to reconfigure the Atari back to its factory configuration, but I usually leave that stuff out because I'm always going in here and tinkering around. And I have some future upgrades planned for this 800XL that I will be showing you guys where to get them and how to install them. One of the upgrades involves upgrading the video to an HDMI, a clean HDMI signal that you can plug directly into a modern TV. And one of the other upgrades that I'm definitely interested in doing is a real-time clock, which allows you to use Sparta-DOS and keep the time and date associated with your file modification times. We're definitely going to do that upgrade as well. So look forward to those videos in the future. And of course, we want to do some basic cleanup on the machine. I like to use the goof off. I don't think I'm going to retrobrite this. I kind of want to leave it as it's in its state, showing that it's ancient, that it is a retro piece of hardware. But I am going to clean up the dirt and gook that it's off it. I usually spray some goof off on these and just rub it with my fingers a little bit to get some of the ingrained and stained dirt off the plastics. As usual, be careful when you're working with this stuff. It is somewhat of a solvent and remover, so you want to be careful around any labels or any type of stickers that you want to keep on there to keep its classic retro sense, if you will. But just take your time and go through and wipe all the gook off, and with a little bit of time and effort you can get a lot of the dirt off it, and it'll clean the case up pretty well and make it look nice. So let's go ahead and plug all the hardware back together. Let's go ahead and connect the 1050 floppy disk drive. We'll connect our monitor. We'll connect our power. Our S drive Max is already connected to the back of the 1050. And if you're interested in learning about the S drive Max, that's actually a hard drive emulator that works on all the 8-bit computers. If you want to learn about that, I'll put a card up at the top, a link where you can go and look at that video that I made for it. Let's go ahead and connect the computer up and just verify that everything works. I think we'll try and start off with some DOS 2.5. We'll boot that from the floppy and see if that comes up correctly, and then we'll take a look at a couple games and maybe a couple demonstrations and just make sure that the computer's working the way it should be. So it looks like DOS is working correctly, the floppy drive, the SIO port is working, so we've got that all working pretty good. I think what we'll try next is we'll try the Ultimate cartridge. Now, the Ultimate cartridge is another tool. It's a cartridge that allows you to use an SD card to load disk images from. If you need to learn about that, I've got a video created for that as well, which I will link at the top. So if you want to take a look at that, go ahead and look at that and you can find out all about the Ultimate card. So we'll go ahead and load up a very popular game back in the day, Karateka. It's actually a karate-based game, uses a joystick. You can also use the keyboard as well. So we'll plug in our monster joystick. This is another piece of hardware that I built in another video. If you're interested in learning about this great joystick that works on all Atari and Commodore computers, I'll create a link for that above. You can go check out that video where I actually ordered and built this monster joystick. Let's go ahead and just play this game real quick and enjoy a little bit of gameplay, since we're always doing programming. and playing around with the hardware, and then we'll go into some other demos as well. Let's go ahead and move on and look at one of the more popular word processors that was available, Atari Writer, back in the day. I used to type a lot of documents on this, and you can get a good feel for this 800XL keyboard actually typing on it. Like I said earlier in the video, I like the 800XL keyboard a little bit better than the XE computers, the 130XE and the 65XE. I just like the feel of it and the keys. And I think if you get your hands on our 800XL yourself, you'll probably have the same feeling as I do about the keyboard. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of the sample demo programs that came with the Atari. Shows off some of the graphic capabilities. So anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you go out there and get yourself some retro Atari computing hardware and enjoy using this classic hardware and the power that it was designed in at the time, and do some programming on it. I encourage everyone to get involved. If you liked the video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, give me some comments on what you'd like to see, some hardware you'd like reviewed. If you've got some old hardware they're not using and you want to donate it to the channel, feel free to send it in and I'll take a look at it and create a video about it and use it. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Happy holidays to all my viewers and subscribers, and we'll see you next year.